I think stories help us make sense of the past, right? They give us grounding in the present, and I think you're right. They give us a sense of a future, of a sense of what lies ahead. There's something incredibly alive about being able to tell your story. The only thing that I wouldn't say surprised me, was a small thing, which I actually would love to talk to people about, is it's clear in this group here that this notion of PTSD is easily dismissed. And yet I think about it a lot in terms of the people that I've interviewed, like for this book on the violence. So I will say that in a place like Chicago, the complication is there's nothing post about it because they're right in the thick of it. I hear what people have said about sort of the notion that you want to be careful not to mistake certain behaviors or responses as PTSD. But I can't help but think, for example, those who've come out of being child soldiers, who've given what they've witnessed, experienced, that they don't suffer from some of the same kind of trauma. I should just tell you a little bit, just very quickly, sort of partly why I respond, why it's one of the things that has struck me today. Here's where we are in this country about the conversation around violence. Children, especially children who've experienced violence, witnessed violence, been victims of violence in a place like Chicago, until very recently, there's been virtually no conversation about the kind of distress it might cause. The massacres at a place like Newtown in Connecticut, and one of the conversations that immediately occurs is, what does it do to the parents and the children who have survived? You don't hear that conversation at all in a place like Chicago. In fact, there's this kind of myth that somehow the kids get hard into it. And so it's part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason why I wanted to write this book. Began spending time in the projects in 1987, and shortly before I got there, Mother Teresa came visited. And I remember her observation was she was struck not by the poverty of the pocketbook, but the poverty of the spirit. One of the things that for me was very clear when I began to spend time in that community was how the community had begun to break apart. There's an incredible amount of distrust because of the violence. One of the things at work is the police are unable to solve crimes. Only 20 to 22% of the murders every year are solved by the police. Only 10% of the shootings of the people who are wounded. So the communities aren't operating as they should. Having said that, they're remarkable people, remarkable resources, but they are communities that I fear have begun to, if not fall apart, have begun to really fragment. In terms of policy, is that not only do you have to think about it in terms of strengthening family, but what policy will also strengthen community. Most of the violence is black on black, Hispanic on Hispanic. The violence is actually taken on a different character. When I wrote There Are No Children Here in 1991, when the violence, as bad as it is now, was worse then. And most of it was drug-related. It was gangs, very hierarchical gangs controlling turf. Usually, not always, but usually there'd be some warning when there was a shooting about to take place because they didn't want to hurt innocent people. In the late 1990s, again, this is the unintended consequence of policy, the law enforcement authorities decided they would go after all the gang leaders. Went after and cut the head off of the snake and put most of the gang leaders in prison. The gangs broke apart. Back in early 90s, when you had 10 or 12 major gangs, there are now 600 to 800 what they call cliques or crews in the city. And now the violence, and this is for me the most dispiriting part, is not over drug trade, but it's over personal disputes. And it has also very much to do with the easy access of guns. So we're talking about very poor communities in a city of great wealth. You grow up on the south or west side of the city, which is predominantly black and Hispanic, and all you need to do is look at the gleaming skyline downtown and know what is not yours, and you know your place in the world. There is ultimately, I think, a lot of resentment and anger, and maybe some of it gets misdirected. The crises that you've all encountered, I mean, clearly the stakes are incredibly high. I mean, matters of life and death. To hear your stories and about sort of your ability to sustain your work and your sense of self during all of that is something that I think is important to remind us in the struggle we have going on here. I think the other thing, too, that I was struck by is that because of my work, I have a lot of interaction with nonprofits and NGOs, mainly dealing in the fields of poverty and violence prevention. And the thing that's striking to me is the kind of certitude they have about what they're doing. And there's almost a sort of unwillingness to ask questions of themselves. So what's important is not only failing forward, but also the fact that you guys are willing to sort of acknowledge those failures. And that you don't see at all, at least I don't see in the nonprofits and NGOs I deal with. I was struck when, Jean-Claude, you were talking about the sense of discovery you've had over the years. My work is to be a constant state of discovery, or I don't know why I should bother. So I wish that there could be some exchange between you and domestic NGOs. I have a really fierce belief in the power of story and the power of narrative. And I think when done well, it does two things. One, it brings us places we otherwise might not go and introduces us to people we otherwise wouldn't meet. And the other thing that stories do is they also affirm our experiences. They give credence to our own personal and collective histories. And more than anything, they make us feel less alone. And so I think there's a real power to story. And I tend to tell stories of people who are struggling and yet persevering. My stories mostly touch on matters of race and class and immigration in this country. I just want to talk a little bit about my work where I feel like I've heard echoes of what you've talked about today. I think it was you, Marie, who were talking earlier about the sort of inclination to talk to, for example, child soldiers or people who have experienced, kids who've come out of war, and to talk about the violence and forget about everything else that's preceded it. And I remember early on my first book, There Are No Children Here, I spent 2 years in a public housing project in Chicago. They were miserable places. They were built on the cheap. They were self-contained. They were the desperately poor, literally stacked one on top of each other. Places of extraordinary violence, mainly because of the drug trade. I mean, the project that I spent time in, there was a moment when rival gangs shot at each other from building to building with semi-automatic weapons, tossing live grenades into apartments. It was that thick with violence. The two boys that I spent time with, they were 12 and 9 years old when I first met them. And in those early weeks when I was just sort of beginning to get to know them and they getting to know me, I would take them out for pizza a couple of times a week. All I wanted to hear about was the violence. You come in as an outsider and the thing you immediately notice is all that feels unfamiliar. And so that's all I wanted to hear. And I remember at one point early on, Pharaoh, the younger of the two boys, started to tell me about a spelling bee that he was studying for. And I said, no. I said, it's interesting, but tell me about, in only the way a 9-year-old kid, he was just completely persistent. And I realized I had not been a particularly good listener. It was a real lesson for me. And clearly the spelling bee was incredibly important to this boy, as was school. And so it really early on got me to sort of think in a very sort of self-conscious way about, despite what these kids have experienced, and it had really damaging effect on their souls, there was so much more to them. I think the other thing that's come up a lot today is this notion of empathy. And I think about this a lot. In fact, I teach a course at Northwestern, which I call the journalism of empathy. And I think empathy is the centripetal force of storytelling. And it's also the centripetal force of community. This ability to imagine yourself as others is what connects us. It's what I'm after in my stories, is this kind of ability not only to put myself in the shoes of the people that I'm spending time with, but to get my readers in that place as well, to get them to look at the world through their eyes. You made this distinction. It's an important distinction between sympathy and empathy, because empathy is not necessarily, you're obviously not necessarily feeling sorry for somebody, but you're also not necessarily excusing what they've done, but you're trying to understand it. The other thing that's come up a lot today is this notion of family, and I have long felt that family is the most important and essential institution out there. And yet I think it's really difficult to sort of figure out how and when and where to intervene in family. A piece I did for the New York Times Magazine a number of years back about a young boy from China who was sent here by his parents at the age of 14, a large number of kids from Fujian province who come here to work in the restaurants. And he got sent here on his own. He didn't know what was going on. His mother literally took him out of school one day, introduced him to this woman who was his smuggler. Then they got on a plane and then made their way to the States, and she came on as sort of falsely identifying as his mom. And he's dropped off in Chinatown. And basically what he learns, he eventually calls his parents, that they've taken out $60,000 debt with the snakeheads. And he's got to earn that money back or they're going to be injured, if not worse. A remarkable young man. His name is Deng Chen. He spends the next 6 years working in Chinese restaurants in New York, in Virginia. Not only does he earn the $60,000 back, he puts himself through school. It's just a remarkable kid. He ends up going briefly to college. A couple of years after the story came back, he and I stayed in touch. And he very sheepishly told me that he was able to, through what's called chain migration now, was able to get his parents to come over here and live with him. And it was complicated. On the one hand, he was really angry with them, but that was his family. That's who he loved, and that's who he relied on. It really sort of impressed on me, those familial connections they're so important. The other thing I thought, you had mentioned at one point this notion that the person who wields the pen gets to tell the story. And I think about this a lot in my own work, because I've been at this now for 40 years, telling other people's stories. The question comes up, from readers or others, who am I to tell somebody's story? And a couple of years ago, I went to teach a class at a maximum security prison in Illinois, Stateville Correctional Facility, and it was all men who were serving fairly long terms, 20 years and longer. And when I was there, I had them do a short 10-minute writing exercise where I asked them to write about their prison cell, and I was so taken with what they wrote that I spent the next year working with a dozen of them on these beautiful essays, stories about their prison cells. One of them told the story about teaching himself to play the piano on a cardboard piano that he had built. Another one was a story about a guy who was a recluse in prison and about how he never wanted to leave his cell. In fact, the New Yorker website published 5 of them, and we hired actors and did an 8-part podcast where the actors read the stories. It has convinced me that I'd want to spend, and what time I have left, want to spend some time sort of teaching, giving people metaphorically the pen so that they can tell their stories, because I realized there was such power in that, and for them it was so empowering. One of them actually reconnected with his daughter as a result. I've got a book now that I've finished. It's coming out in March, and it's a collection of stories from one summer in Chicago about these very intimate stories about people emerging from the violence and trying to reckon with it. I feel like the more I know, the less I know, and so I wanted to write a book that didn't deal at all with policy issues, because I think nobody's figured it out. Deal with what violence does to the spirit of individual and to the spirit of community. I mean, the numbers in Chicago, just to back up, are absolutely staggering. I mean, the past 20 years, we've had 14,000 people killed and another 60,000 people wounded by gunfire. And this is in a fairly concentrated part of the city. There's a story in the book about a young man, was not young anymore, he's 40 years old, who killed somebody when he was 17, and about trying to forgive yourself for what you've done. There's a story about a mother whose son is killed trying to rob a drug dealer, and it's about forgiving the person who murdered her son, because she realizes the sort of line between perpetrator and victim is so thin that it could have just as well been the other way. When I was working on this book, I don't know if anybody has read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, but there's a moment towards the end of the book where there's this line that I think about a lot, where he writes, "I know one truth, stories save us." And I think that's really important. They do. Stories are essential to who we are as human beings, and telling stories is the way we make sense of our own lives and make sense of the world around us. So anyway, you guys have given me a lot of food for thought, and I appreciate you guys having me here. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So,
This is fun.